down to Biscayne.
Yeah. 5 on the floor, ride for my dogs. Where here's the thing, you can check the score. Hustle hard, couple scars, wearing bubble frauds. Just like Butler said, you in trouble, y'all. Kept the floor playing, got it all banned. Y'all seen the block, stop with one hand. And Pat we trust, it's power, have the guts. We're here to bring the heat, y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to 5 on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, and Alex Toledo, plus others from the 5 Reasons Sports Network.
Welcome into the latest episode of 5 on the Floor. I'm your host, Greg Sylvander. Today's floor plan with me, Brady Hawk. You can follow him at Brady Hawk 305. No Ethan, no Alex. Ethan is on vacation. I technically am too, but we have enough, and that's okay. Today's floor plan is something that we talked about on Playback recently. Actually, Alex and Brady, and I know some others jumped in and had some thoughts on it as well. We want to talk about the two young prospects in Miami, and that is Jaime Jaquez and Nikola Jovic, and maybe even the idea of which player would you rather keep in the event that you had to send one to Portland to acquire Damian Lillard. So we're going to get into both of their games, their contracts, who we think they may keep, who we rather they keep, and all of the above. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you about a great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network and 5 on the Floor, and that is Aggressive Insurance. Y'all know her from the post-game shows. Y'all know her from Playback. Aggressive Insurance is a broker agency that's been servicing South Florida for over 15 years, offering auto, homeowners, condo, life insurance, retirement programs, free notary service to every client, representing many, if not all, of the leading insurance carriers in South Florida. So if you have a bad driving record, no problem. No driver is refused. Free phone quotes. It's as easy as giving her a call. But also checking out the website, insurancebyLynette.com. This is the place to go first, y'all. Insurance by Lynette. That's with Lynette, 2 N's, 2 T's.com. Or you can find her on Twitter, at Aggressive Insurance, Aggressive Insurance on Facebook, and Aggressive_insurance on Instagram. Again, Aggressive Insurance. That is your go-to for all your insurance needs. All right, so here we go. Welcome, Brady Hawk. I am excited about this topic because I think it ties into what is on the top of Heat fans' minds, and it's something that I think garnered a lot of attention and interaction on Playback. So we thought, why not dedicate an episode for anyone who listens to our show, but maybe is not subscribed to Off the Floor, or maybe didn't catch Playback? We want to get down to the nitty gritty here. So I'll start by saying this. It appears as if Portland and Miami are still in that staring contest, and there does appear to be indications that maybe the offer is starting to come together in terms of conceptually what it's going to take to get him. Shams has thrown out different packages, which we've talked about. And the biggest part of it is that there was a little note there about young players coming back. And we know Tyler Hero, while being a young player, is not going to end up in Miami. So what young players is Portland or Shams talking about that they may get back? Well, there's two in particular. There's Jaime Jaquez, who the Heat just drafted, and then there's Nikola Jovic, who they drafted last year and have invested a ton of time into. We expect, or I expect, that probably one of the two is going to need to be included in this when it's all said and done. If they keep both, that will be an amazing circumstance I don't expect. Brady, I'll start here before we get into the nitty-gritty. I just want to ask you off top, are you preparing yourself to have one of the two or to lose both?
I would say probably one of the two. That's probably where I'd lean, even though it feels like some people want it to be both. For obvious reasons. But I thought it was funny with the Shams report. I know you guys already talked about that stuff, but for one, I thought it was funny that the option at the bottom of that list of a trade possibility was young player was at the bottom. Like, because that feels like the sticking point of this all. That feels like the thing that's the revolving door of what's going to happen. And the second part of it was that there was a little parenthesis at the end of that with the S, which was, is it going to be one? Is it going to be two? Like, we don't know at that point. But that's the big question. And then that's when it comes to the fact, I know we've been talking about it from both perspectives. It's like, which guy would Portland rather? Which guy would Miami rather give up? At the end of the day, shout out to Alex. It was it does feel like we're preparing ourselves for at least to keep one. But then the question I think that we're going to get into is like, if you keep one, or which one that is, are they going to be in a potential rotation moving forward this season, or is this more of a long-term kind of move?
And that's a great question. And I think it's going to drive the decision-making on maybe both sides of this, which I think is an interesting element, just to bring everyone up to speed where we stand on these two young players' contracts. Jaime Jaquez obviously was drafted in the first round of the most recent draft. He's coming in at $3.5 million for the upcoming season. And then Nikola Jovic, who was a bit of a later pick in the first round, so his rookie scale contract has him on the books for $2.3 million. But what you're essentially seeing is two cost-controlled players you're going to be able to develop, offer their next contract to without really the worry of them heading elsewhere, and really build a relationship with said player. And I think Portland is obviously signaling a rebuilding phase. So let's start here. For the fans that don't watch college basketball and didn't pay attention to the draft because they don't watch college basketball, let's start with Jaime Jaquez Jr., more of the unknown, I'll say. Just from a sheer basketball perspective, and we've gone over some of this before, but as we compare it to keeping Jovic and what you'd have to do differently, let's start with the basketball side of, if you kept Jaime Jaquez, what role you see him in, what holes he would plug skill set wise, and just kind of paint the picture of what Heat fans would be getting if Jaquez is the guy who stays.
Yeah, so I think Jaquez, if he stays in the rotation, and there's a couple of reasons. I think in an idea where you're sending out a bunch of guys for Dame, you're going to need some high-level role players to be at the back end of your rotation. But for one, you can never have enough wings. Like that type of build will always be utilized, especially in an Eric Spoelstra system. Just because he's a wing, he'll probably be playing backup five at some point. No, I'm kidding. Maybe. I don't know. We might see that. But the ways that they can be utilized, I mean, the question is, if you're keeping Caleb, you still have Caleb in the mix potentially off the bench. Like it's crowded, but that's a good thing. Like you can utilize them in similar ways. I think ideally it's not comparable to, I'd say, Caleb now. I think it's comparable to the first year that Caleb was here, where everybody was talking about Jimmy Light and just kind of using him in similar ways. When Jimmy was out, they put him in that role and they let him kind of off the leash to a certain degree. Not what we saw against Boston in the playoffs, but we saw like a hint of it, what led us to believe what we saw in the playoffs last year. So I think it's a kind of like that. I think there's certain things that he could do in isolation that probably won't translate the best, just because it's going to be more of a system movement offense, but there's still opportunities to attack off closeouts and one-on-ones. The thing that I keep saying, I think his spot up three and shooting is going to surprise people, just because that was not really a talked about element of his game heading in. It's more about all the other stuff, getting to the basket. But he feels to me like a player that can surprise some from three, because he's the type of guy in an offense that if you potentially have a Damian Lillard type, he's the guy you're helping off of in that lineup. And he can make you pay off a closeout, but he also, I think, can shoot it pretty well. So that's going to be the thing to monitor. Defensively, I do believe he could hold up. Like there's certain things I think that people are looking at. We went over this on playback like a ton. Like it was like, in my opinion, like there's certain things like going around screens. I think there could be some issues with maybe at certain points if he has to like stay on the perimeter and constantly has to trail. But the off-ball stuff has absolutely been there. I think that's why the Jimmy comparison was there, just because he reads passing lanes really well. He does all that type of stuff. That he just strikes me as a player that Spo would love. Like that's what he feels like to me. Like there's somebody that Spo would like to have on the floor. And it's funny because I know we're going to get into Jovic next, but it feels like we're talking about Jaquez being the now player and Jovic being the long-term, when Jaquez is the rookie this year and Jovic is the sophomore, which is kind of backwards. But it feels like that more so just for position and play style. That's kind of where I lean.
I'm glad you said that, because Jovic was drafted earlier, and there's been all the stories about him not even finishing high school yet, but still playing in the NBA. So he is actually, I guess, in theory, maybe a little less ready in theory than Jaime Jaquez would be coming out Jaquez was a senior. And he was a big part of everything they did at UCLA. Jovic, even as he played overseas, did not have a necessarily prominent role. He wasn't like the leading scorer on his team, if I remember correctly. And I know that he played a lot of point guard. But the big thing here is that Jovic has taken a big jump in 1 year in one way, and we're going to get into that next. To close the loop on Jaquez, I guess I'll say this, because I agree with everything you said basketball-wise. He fits in perfectly, perfect Swiss Army knife. Exactly. I think you make the Caleb year one compare. The year one Caleb is what we'll say. That is such a great comparison. I'll remind everyone, year one Caleb was a DNP CD in game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals. And we saw how much changed in 1 year. Obviously, he's a little bit older of a player, slightly, but I guess that's another element of where if you rely on some of these wing young players to find their way, maybe deep in the playoffs, I don't know how much you can rely on them. And also there's another element about Jaquez. If you're keeping Caleb Martin, maybe Jaquez makes sense to include in the deal. If Caleb Martin has to be a part of this deal because he's an expiring contract, which Shams indicated is now more of a desired thing than I think a Duncan Robinson. So I think we can start to peg maybe Lowry in that deal. But this begs the question, because Caleb Martin is also an expiring contract. If he were to go, the Heat may be inclined to keep Jaquez to kind of keep somebody in the reserves that has some of that skill set, but we don't know how that's going to break out next. The next guy, though, it's really interesting and it's polarizing. And in theory, he solves so many issues and he's a really fun player to talk about. And that's Nikola Jovic. Before we dive into him, though, I want to talk about Joe Cronin and his disastrous offseason. Because when a disaster strikes in your home or business, you need specialized, fast, and reliable service. Water Cleanup of Florida understands the impact and stress any unexpected disaster may cause. Before hurricane season, you need to call these guys. With over 60 years of combined experience, Michael, Robert, and their team are prepared to handle any size disaster. They have great maintenance programs, third-generation contractors in South Florida. They are licensed A to Z, one-stop shopping for every busy homeowner. No need to bring in any other contractors. They'll handle it all for you. Again, that's Water Cleanup of Florida. Call Michael anytime on his personal cell. That's 954-579-0356. Again, call Michael at Water Cleanup of Florida anytime on his personal cell, 954-579-0356. If you got the schmutz, they got the guts. So Nikola Jovic, I had a league source I checked in with as I've kind of taken a breather recently, who felt that as the more he checked around the league, the more people he talked to, he felt like Portland's more inclined to take Jaime Jaquez in that deal, and they would ask for Jaquez before Jovic, which I thought was interesting. I want to preface everything I'm saying now by also mentioning Nikola Jovic is this scouting department's find. They don't really draft international prospects often. This is a guy that they pegged, that they loved, they've developed. He's bought into the strength and conditioning program in a way that few young players who have came to Miami have so adamantly been open-minded to diving into whatever is suggested of him. And here's the kicker. He's the perfect 4 next to Bam in theory. And that's the thing that we all want to talk about, right? But is he ready? Is he ready to contribute now? Is he ready to contribute in the playoffs? And so that's the question mark. Let's talk skills first. And then as we close the show, we're both going to get on record who we would rather keep. Brady may have already divulged this during playback, but we're going to get it on the record on 5 on the Floor. Jovic as a basketball player, not only what we saw last year, but what he could be based on his skill set and his physical frame as it changes. What do you see from Jovic next year that could be particularly beneficial for this Heat group, with or without Dame Lillard?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's dependent on role, and I think that's why it's important to mention first, like, when we mention Jaquez like fitting right into a role, it's like harder to find that spot for Jovic because, like, yeah, we could say he's the perfect big next to Bam, but like, will they actually start him at the 4? Like, I don't think so. Like in this current moment. And then the thing that I feel like I keep saying on every one of these shows as we like talk about the roster heading in next season is like the backup front court gets very weird just because if you have a Thomas Bryant type or you have somebody like that or Kevin Love all of a sudden is not in the starting lineup, it's like there's not enough defense in that front court that you basically, if you play, you have to play zone the entire time, that Eric Spoelstra just will not lean into that. So it's harder to like depict Jovic's role in a situation where they get Dame or not compared to Jaquez. And that's why kind of I made that point before. To your point, the starting lineup's kind of the easiest fit to a certain degree. So obviously, as a player, though, I think some of the stuff they saw in Summer League, like the size thing's big, because I think you saw him being more physical than he was a year ago, even in Summer League. Like that was obviously a big difference. Some of the stuff that I like that I think could carry over, and I shouldn't be talking pace on here because it'll probably never happen. But the stuff that he was able to do where he'd get a rebound and go in the other direction and just the way he was able to do that stuff, he had body control where he's knocking into people, kind of having that control to still finish at the rim. Like that stuff is just like a gift. That's a skill that he just has that you have to let him go and do. So I think that part of it's interesting. The passing in the half court, I think there's just stuff that they could endlessly do with, we could say, I always just say Jovic and Bam, but like Jovic, Bam, Jimmy, Dame potentially, like there's a lot of passing in that lineup that you're going to have to figure things out. That's a Spo dream to have that much passing and movement. And then I guess the one thing that I think could push them over the edge to say, okay, this guy could play right now is the shooting to me. Like if the shooting was up and down, like it was in the rookie year, and I think there was certain mechanics I kept noting throughout Summer League that I thought changed. Like some things were quicker, some things felt like a little smoother. If he could shoot a decent percentage from three, that changes everything to me, because this is a team now where you kind of have to shoot the spot up three to maximize their top players, like when you kind of look at stuff on paper. So if he's able to do that, now we can start having a real conversation about him contributing now. Because like I don't want to discredit and say like Jaquez, we haven't even seen Jaquez play like an NBA game yet, say, oh, this guy can play now, but Jovic can't. It's just dependent on certain variables. And that variable for Jovic to me is shooting. So that'll be something interesting to monitor if he is the one that's back.
It's a great point, because Jaquez is going to be able to impact the game in ways other than just shooting specifically. And so that Swiss Army knife nature of his game obviously plays into what Eric Spoelstra can get creative with. And you think about lineups with J. Rich and Caleb and Jaquez and just different things they can do, and Jimmy. And you're right, like fitting Jovic into that equation. If he becomes the best version of himself, obviously it's easy to slot in a stretch four who's young and athletic with amazing vision as a passer, etc. But it's how quick can you get there? And with Portland kind of, and I know that they scouted Jaquez, they were interested in him pre-draft and them wanting him. There has been some notion that maybe getting guys like Jaquez, getting a guy like Chris Murray in Portland are older rookies, so they can maybe tutor the younger guys. So maybe that's why they prefer Jaquez. The one thing also is with Chris Murray, I don't know if maybe they envision that Nikola Jovic would play the same position as him. So maybe that plays into why they would want Jaquez, although I could see Jaquez eating into Chris Murray's minutes. So again,
and Jeremy Grant, but they just signed a big contract too. So
like that's such a great point. Like they've invested 5 years and crazy $1 million in a player that plays that position. So Jaquez probably just checks more boxes of what they can use now, but the Heat are going to play hardball, and who knows how this works. We'll say all this and watch the Heat keep both of them, right? And they end up figuring out other ways. So they will get creative. But it's a tough choice, because I think long-term people see the stuff Jovic does and they say, gosh, if that were to work in its purest form, it would just serve so many purposes for this team. But when you're thinking about the Dame and Jimmy window, I would be lying if I said that I don't. Just a gut feeling that Jaquez is going to be able to get involved in that and feel ready to contribute sooner. That is my gut feeling, and it's why, despite the fact I love Nikola Jovic, the scouting staff loves Nikola Jovic. I know it's an Adam Simon special, it's been said to me. So I know they really want to keep him around. I personally think Jaime Jaquez may be better for the basketball portion of this conversation, all emotions aside. That's where I go. Where do you stand on it, Brady?
So I totally agree with the part that, like, as I said before, like if this is a one season sample size, or like even let's say a season sample size, I do believe Jaquez would be the way you lean. And in a position where you're going all in for a guy like Dame, where you're saying your championship window is right now, Jaquez makes more sense. With that said, I think if you're picking between the two to say which guy would you rather, I still think you might lean Jovic.
Woo!
I think you would in terms of it's funny because it really goes against everything I was saying about everything, like the basketball side of things and everything. But I just believe there's more to his game in terms of the stuff that they can do with it. And there's also more past this season. Like just because we're saying right now past this, like this season, it makes more sense.
Upside.
There's still the fact that when a potential Dame Jimmy era is done, that they have the next era ready to go potentially in the back of their minds. Because like Tyler Bam was that next page. And in a position where you're going Tyler for Dame, you have to have that next page. And that's kind of where I think you would ideally put your eggs in this current moment. And things change, especially with the Heat, where you cannot predict what they're going to do in 5 years because everything's going to look totally different because everything moves so quickly with this team. But I do think if it was that simple where you're saying one or the other, I would say Jovic. And it's interesting because your points you made is kind of eye-opening because I keep saying to myself, like, if I'm Portland, I'm definitely like, that's why I mentally prepared myself that Jaquez is more likely to come back than Jovic. But it does make sense in theory that like they would rather possibly could lean in Jaquez over Jovic for the fact, for one, the extra year. Like I think that could be big for them to say that we have another like that extra year for a guy. And he also just like having a second rookie is just like somebody that you can mold as your own and not somebody that's coming from another system. I just feel like would be important. But the stuff about him playing in the stuff about what was the part that you said about I'm trying to think of exactly what you said about the deal.
Related to like the guys that they already have and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, they have Chris Murray. They have Jeremy Grant. They have there's somebody else on that damn team that I thought maybe.
There was a couple, but either way, it's still just it does make sense. I think it plugs in a little bit easier. But let me ask one final question because I'm wondering, like, we could say the Jovic or Jaquez thing, but who do you think opinion matters more? Like who Miami wants to keep or who Portland wants?
I think today it's who Miami wants to keep. And this is a great question. This is a pot all on its own. But I think that as this goes on and we get closer to training camp, I do think the Heat will be motivated to finally like dot the T's and cross the I's. And I said that incorrectly on purpose, y'all, to get this deal done. Because like you want to go into training camp with your roster. The Jovic thing, though, you sold me there at the end about this next generation. Because without Tyler, if you're thinking ahead, Jaquez may have a ceiling and Jovic, and I call Bam no ceiling, Jovic may have a higher ceiling, particularly in the next few years. So I see where you're going there. It'll be interesting to see who they choose. And I'll just reiterate for everyone listening, I am mentally preparing to lose Tyler Hero to a third team, Jaquez and Jovic. So I come back feeling happy that any of them stayed in terms of Jovic and Jaquez. I don't think Tyler staying is an option. So it'll be interesting to see where they go. I do think that it is, if the other part of this, though, and I will close here, is that we just don't know what this deal is going to look like. And when we start involving expiring contracts, the two expiring contracts on Miami's team are Kyle Lowry and Caleb Martin. And so if it's Kyle Lowry, it means it's such a big deal that the Heat are bringing back more players than just Dame Lillard. So that matters in all this conversation that we just had. But also, what if the expiring contract they're referencing is Caleb Martin because the Heat don't want to pay him in a year? I know that sounds counterintuitive to winning a title now, but if you know you're going to lose him for nothing like you just did Max Strus, do you say, let's groom Jaquez, send Caleb out? There's so many variables. We're never going to be able to get to the bottom of them. But at least we did a show where we didn't agree. I chose Jaquez. Brady chose Jovic. I know that there's many in the network that are pounding the table for Jovic, including Eternal and Brian Fonseca. But it's been a good conversation. Shout out to our sponsors. That is Water Cleanup of Florida and Aggressive Insurance. We'll have you covered the rest of the week. Ethan will be back soon. Alex will be checked in. We appreciate it and talk to y'all next time. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Five on the Floor on the Five Regional Sports Network.